Hello, everyone. We're going to give everybody a few minutes to join. I see people signing in now. Just going to give it a couple of minutes and then we'll get started. Welcome to those just joining. We are going to wait a few minutes to get started and give everybody a chance to join. Just a few more minutes here and we will get started. Let's see, we still have some more people joining. A few more minutes here to join. Thank you for your question, Thomas. We will answer that in the course of the webinar. And a recording of this webinar will be available. Waiting a few more minutes for people to join. Alrighty. Alrighty, let's get started. Welcome everyone. I am Adam Lush, Regional Resource Director for the Greater Philadelphia area and Delaware. Thank you for joining us for our 7th webinar in our View from the Mountain webinar series in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Today's presentation will be somewhat different from our previous webinars. We will have a formal presentation and are offering 1 hour of continuing education for social workers. We would like to thank our educational sponsor, Jumana Grassi, for assisting in obtaining these credits. Please keep your Zoom session open at the end of the presentation to access the post-event evaluation to obtain your 1 hour credit. A certificate will be emailed to you from Jumana within the next 2 weeks. As a reminder, we will be conducting this session in webinar format. All participant microphones will be muted. During the presentation, please utilize the Q&A feature to ask any questions you may have. Depending on the volume of questions, if we can't get to your question before the end of the hour, we will have someone from our team follow up with you directly. Now, I would like to welcome our speaker, Kate Appelman, who is the Senior Clinical Director of Men's Services at Caron. Since 2005, Kate has been a clinician working specifically in adult behavioral health treatment with a focus on relapse prevention, family systems, and behavioral addictions. In addition, since 2013, she has been working with and developing programs for executives, healthcare professionals, and opioid addiction. Her tenure at Caron has allowed her to receive training in addiction interaction disorder and professional development. She holds a Master's of Arts in Counseling Psychology from Rosemont College, is a certified clinical supervisor, and a certified advanced alcohol and drug counselor, and holds a CSAT and CMAT certifications. Welcome, Kate.
Thank you so much, Adam. Thank you for being here today. For some of you, maybe you're eating lunch or just carved an hour out of your day to be here with us. It's really important topic to talk about. One of the things that I actually was thinking about starting with was all of the common themes of the COVID pandemic coping skills sessions that many of us have been a part of. And honestly, my hope here is that for some of you, it may be a little bit of a different perspective. For some of you, it may feel like a refresher as to where we are, as many of us are about 7 or 8 weeks into stay-at-home orders. my hope is that you can use this presentation as a reference and a resource. I have to say that I have way too much information in the presentation because the goal is for you to use it as a resource, not only for your clients, but also for yourself. I have a belief that we can't take people to places that we're not either able or willing to go ourselves. So many times it's really important to make sure that we're looking at the parallel process. So when we look at some of the items that we plan to explore today, one of the elements that I want to talk about is, really looking at our current reality and collective grief, what that means, how we're coping, how our clients are coping, because the parallel process is very true for us. I also want to take a look at social isolation and what it means when coping goes wrong, and what that means for us as clinicians and what it means for our clients and some solutions. I also, in the 16 years I've been at Caron, I have participated in clinical supervision in a plethora of ways, and I would be remiss if I did not include an element of clinical supervision and really looking at the parallel process. So we're going to do a lot of that in the next hour. And then any presentation that I have ever done, no matter what research, statistics, trends, information is in the presentation, I always like to end with practical application. I've done that as a clinician over the years. All of this sounds great, and what does it mean for all of us? And we're going to talk about that a little bit today. I actually want to start with a passage from one of my favorite books. It is a passage that literally I've been thinking about a lot over the past 2 months. And for some of you, this may be a review. For some people, it might be a refresher. But just bear with me for a minute so I can read this and we can all be on the same page. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. Charles Dickens has a way of using words to really describe how the reality for those in the story can differ based on the perspective of the individual. And we're seeing a lot of that today in our practices, in our personal lives. And when we really look at how well we all cope, it's really based on, the role that we play and the experiences that we have. I heard this phrase a few weeks ago on Facebook that has really stuck with me. There are many phrases on social media that I do not want to be stuck with me. This is one that really made a whole lot of sense. And the person had said that we are all in the same storm, but we're not all in the same boat. And when we look at a lot of the different experiences that we have, we also need to look at how is it that we're coping? When we look at our current reality, there's a few things that are really true. As of yesterday, May 4th, in the United States, there were 1.1 million cases of COVID, 67,000 deaths. When we look at where we sit currently with COVID, there's other experiences that we've had in our lifetime that there's some similarities, and it's not exactly the same. You think about the increased rates of major depressive disorder after Hurricane Katrina. 1 in 10 New Yorkers experienced active PTSD symptoms within the first month after 9/11. You think about communities affected by the Deepwater Horizon spill and the fact that they showed a significant amount of depressive and anxiety-related symptoms. And when we look at the symptoms related to SARS and PTSD and distress issues, all of those elements are things that we've experienced in our lifetime, and it's not exactly how it is right now. The truth is, when we look at the concept of collective grief, it really highlights the fact that we're all experiencing loss in one way or the other. And as we look at the work that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross has done around grief and loss, for many of us, we acknowledge that grief and loss is not a linear process. And we find ourselves dancing between depression and bargaining and denial and maybe back to bargaining. I really appreciate David Kessler's work looking at the 6th stage of grief as purpose. And we're going to talk about that a little bit today. Again, when we look at a parallel process, it's not only looking at the purpose that our clients have, but really looking at where has our purpose been. The truth is, in the midst of all of this, only one thing has changed, which is everything. Our job security really hinges on the fact that change is hard for people. And change is the most stressful thing that we will ever go through. And by the way, our lives for all of us have changed in one way or the other. And we had little time to prepare for all of it. So all of the things that we've talked about over the past couple of weeks, I don't know about all of you, but I have found myself getting into this mode where I want to put my head down and do the next right thing and make the best decisions I can with the information that I have at the time, acknowledging that I feel as though I'm shooting at a moving target consistently because things are changing. I have at home, I have three children, ages 17, 10, and 10 months. I probably need my own support group for all of that. And a husband who's working from home and teaching live with his students. And everything about our life has changed. But it's not just for us, it's for everyone. The reality is when we look at the way that work has changed for most people. 17 million unemployment claims as of 2 weeks ago. We look at the fact that there are people that are currently unemployed. There are people that work from home that don't normally work from home. There are people that, for those of us who continue to come to the office, that landscape has significantly changed. And the amount of people that are on the front line of first responders that are in the midst of hazardous situation, no matter how you swing it, we're all in the same storm, even though our boats are different. Whether we're unemployed in hazardous situations, working from home, the amount of stress that everyone is experiencing is pretty difficult. While it's not just our routines and our rituals that have changed, there's a deeper reason why we all feel so unsettled. The reality is that our stress response is activated when our basic needs are threatened. And if we look at brain development and we look at the importance of safety, the importance of everything that makes us mammals, the need to care for our young and to keep them safe, the need to create safety, to have. When we look at shelves being empty at grocery stores at times, it's not a typical reality for many of us, and at times there's less goods for us. When we think about the ways that we can care for our young and the amount of powerlessness that we have in the ways that we care about the people that we love and the ways that we care about our clients, in so many different ways, it's really not about work and it's not about what's happening at grocery stores and wearing masks and waiting in line. Those are all symptoms of deep-rooted concerns that we have, because the reality is when we look at our stress response being activated when our basic needs are threatened, our existence is challenged at this time. So of course we're going to be in a position where we're going to struggle with more anxiety. We're going to be afraid, and it's going to be collective fear in many different ways. When we look at, there was an article that came out just a few weeks ago from the Harvard Business Review entitled, "That Discomfort That You're Feeling is Grief." The author of that really talked about the concept of collective grief. And I don't know about you, but I've seen a lot of webinars and information on collective grief. It makes a lot of sense. The truth is, when we think about the amount of uncertainty that there is right now, there are so many questions that you just can't answer. And I don't know about you, but for me, I like to have answers to things. It makes me feel more comfortable. And the truth is, there are many things that we just don't know what the answer is to. When is this going to end? We don't know. Will I or a loved one get COVID? We don't know. If they do, are they going to be okay? We don't know. What's going to happen after this? Is life going to be different when it's all, quote, over? We don't know. What we do know is we can assume that some things are going to become a new norm. And the question is, in the midst of all of this, how do we as clinicians, but also our clients, how are we in a position to really help them looking at the new norm and really looking at what are some of the coping mechanisms that we have in place that historically have worked that we don't have access to right now? So when we say that one thing has changed and it's really everything, there's a whole new way that we need to navigate the way that we interact with each other, the way that we care for ourselves, the way that we understand purpose and meaning and connection. And that's what people are struggling with. And when I say struggle, I don't mean it in a negative sense. I think the struggle is a good thing. If we weren't struggling, we would continue to try to do the same thing based on old information. The struggle really lives in the fact that we're trying to change along with it. And what does that mean for our clients? Again, we have pretty secure jobs when it comes to people's difficulty in navigating change. Because for many of us, that's our job. We help people navigate pain. I work in an inpatient chemical dependency setting where we look at addiction and mental health disorders and process addictions. I work with a lot of people that really struggle to change. And most people that seek out mental health services, they're there because they're struggling with change. And what does all of this mean for us? So there was a poll that was taken by Psychiatry and Behavioral Health Learning Network that was taken just a few days ago. It was April 30th. A few statistics that are interesting and very applicable to where we are right now. 48% of people identified that they have anxiety about coming down with COVID and contracting it. 40% are anxious about serious illness and death, in addition to that. And then 62% are anxious about loved ones getting it. We all know that there's something dangerous around us, but we can't quite see it, right? When we think about how all of this has impacted us individually in a micro level, but also collectively at a macro level, everyone is losing something. And the truth is, none of us actually know what we're doing. That's the truth of it. No one has lived through a pandemic before. Here, none of us know what we're doing. And this is the first global pandemic in our lifetime. None of us know. And those who pretend to know, that's what they're doing. They're pretending. I think we're doing the best we can with what we have, and we can do better. For those of us trained in DBT, it's a piece that I find so true in my soul, that we are doing the best we can and we can do better. When we look at the fact that fear, there can be fear in that truth that we don't know, and there's solace in the reality of not knowing. I'm a big fan of Brene Brown. I very much value and respect her work. And one of the things that she says is being new at something is the epitome of vulnerability. Genuine possibility and creativity, they actually start with vulnerability, but the truth is that's not a natural place for most people to go. Vulnerability. Because when we look at some of the core beliefs that either us or our clients have around vulnerability, we may have that initial ping that we feel exposed. We feel weak. People may misjudge it or misunderstand it. And for many of our clients, when we talk about where we have a tendency to go first, I really want to talk about what happens when coping does not go well. What does that look like for us? So I want to stay specific to COVID-19 for a minute. Here's what we're seeing, right? And after 7 weeks of this, we all know what it looks like. It's changing as we start to look at some of the states identifying ways to ease out of stay-at-home orders. The reality is that we've seen people who are afraid. And when we're afraid, we're stockpiling. And we're also looking at the ways that we're buying bulk alcohol in bulk. When do we know that the isolation specific to COVID is a problem? You know, when we're in a position where we're avoiding virtual engagements, where we have calls and texts that are coming through and there's more isolation. When we're missing work and obligations. I'm thinking about a client that just came into treatment here within the past 2 weeks that had the capability of fully working from home and ended up in treatment because he couldn't keep work commitments, despite the fact that he self-identifies that work was the only commitment that he had. But his drinking and his anxiety and his depression had gotten so bad that he wasn't able to keep calls. He wasn't able to keep personal hygiene to actually get on Zoom calls with his peers. When we look at using alcohol more often in larger amounts and over a longer period of time, what does that look like? And by the way, it's not just alcohol. What does our prescription pill use look like? There are many webinars, and I think there's one coming up shortly here, where we talk about the increased use of marijuana and what that looks like in our society, even pre-COVID, nonetheless, where we are in this pandemic. We also are going to talk a little bit about process addictions. We do a lot of process addiction work here at Caron, and when we go through and really look at some of the statistics related to process addictions, it's going to be important to really identify where are our mental health services going to be needed now, but also moving forward as a result of this isolation. And when we look at some of the maladaptive coping skills, the truth is that there was a study that was done within the past 2 weeks that came out by the National Institute of Health, and 59% of Americans identified a belief that COVID and the stay at home is impacting their daily lives, obviously. And out of those, or as a whole in the United States, 38% of people are worried about their mental health. There's also, and that poll was as recent as May 2nd. There was the Washington Post reported that an article published by the Kaiser Family Foundation last month showed nearly half of the people in the United States feel that the COVID crisis is harming their mental health, and is really looking at the increased rates of anxiety and depression that are leading to a lot of these maladaptive coping skills. And we're seeing it in statistics. We're seeing it here in treatment. Alcohol sales have risen 55% in 1 week alone, and online alcohol sales are up 243%. When I look at some of the concerns around process addictions and the use of food to self-soothe in the midst of isolation, there are many different stories that we are getting here around that. I also want to talk about gaming and gambling and pornography. When we look at some of the virtual ways that people connect to gaming and gambling, we're seeing a significant increase in process addictions here at Caron, including sex addiction. So when we look at pornography, part of my background is in, I'm a certified sex addiction therapist. So when we look at some common websites for pornography, your Pornhubs and so on and so forth, they actually do a pretty good job looking at statistics related to the amount of pornography use in the United States. So about a week ago, I was taking a look at the newer statistics, and that means that you actually have to go on Pornhub to find them. So I'm sitting and having a cup of coffee, and my 9-month-old is sitting in her high chair, and I'm on Pornhub looking for statistics, and it was difficult to explain when my husband came downstairs. But the reality is, when you look at the statistics of increases in pornography use, Pornhub identifies a 25% increase at the end of March is a reality of pornography use. And again, Pornhub is one of the largest used pornography sites in the United States. And it's actually still up 10% higher than pre-COVID. So when we look at what is occurring, when we look at increase in gaming, increases in online gambling, that when we look at some of the statistics around gambling, they're actually staying pretty consistent. And we don't have sports betting right now. So think about that. So when we look at some of these process addictions, it's really important to start thinking about, from an addiction standpoint, what does addiction look like and how should we be watching out for it? So think about the clients that are on your caseload. Addiction is really characterized by more than we had intended, behaviors that are occurring outside of our value system, right? That's a cornerstone of addiction. I value honesty and I lie. I value commitment and I don't show up. I value fidelity and I cheat. I value hard work and I can't show up to work on my Zoom meetings and I end up in treatment. What I value and how I behave conflict. And that's really, if you think about it, that's where shame comes from. So as we start thinking about different elements related to not just substance use, alcohol, chemicals, we're not only talking about pill and alcohol use, but starting to think about where is it that addictive qualities have lent themselves to electronics? What does that look like? I ran a lecture the other day on addiction interaction disorder, looking at the ways that process addictions and chemical addictions really feed off of one another. And there was a group of us that had this conversation around electronics and the fact that it's such a double-edged sword. To a certain degree, we have information that's at our fingertips, right? And we have the capability of being informed consistently. But when we look at the amount of information that is coming across, our eyes, it's pretty incredible the reactions that we are having to it. And not only that, but looking at the ways that social media really frames the way that we see our current reality. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we go along. We think about sex, right? We think about the use of prostitution and affairs and fantasy, going outside of our value system, increased use in pornography, or maybe starting pornography use where we wouldn't have done it before. We start thinking about some of the other elements as we look at over-exercise, as we look at gambling, as we look at money and the value of money as it relates to even work. And then we can spend an entire other seminar on food addiction and the way that the brain chemically reacts to sugar and processed food. So we start to think about, from an addictive standpoint, where are we and what does that look like? So how are our clients leaning into medicators as a result of fear? So COVID really forces us to be with ourselves more in a time of incredible fear. There's a phrase that we'll talk about a little bit later as we talk about, the fact that we're in the midst of a marathon and not a sprint. For many people, as we looked at making that initial transition as a result of COVID, many of us felt sprint-like, trying to figure out how to get our services virtual, trying to really look at, if I'm continuing to go into the office and meeting with clients one-on-one like we do here, how do I do so in a way that keeps them and myself and my family safe? And as we look at this kind of sprint, we're now starting to settle in and having fatigue, many of us, because we're realizing that we are, in fact, in a marathon. And our clients are realizing that too. Fear has resulted in the sprint, and we're starting to fatigue. And then at that point, when we start looking at that fatigue, we're going to want to medicate to numb, to avoid, to fill time. How many of our clients are struggling with boredom? I many times think about the clients that I work with, and I've worked as a therapist in our relapse program for 5 years, and boredom was always a funny thing that we talked about. And they would identify boredom as a trigger for themselves. And processing boredom it's not really boredom. That's not what it is. It's actually an inability to be comfortable within your own skin. And for some people, there's been this relief in time being able to slow down and spending more time with their families and not rushing as much. I personally can relate to that a little bit. But on the flip side of it, as we look at really being able to sit with ourselves, what comes up for us? And how many times are we trying to avoid and numb? Have we changed to a diet that isn't really suiting us and we feel shame around and don't feel healthy in? Have we had an incredible fear about and with money that we find ourselves hoarding, preoccupied, obsessed? Have we find ourselves using sexual acting out as a way to feel better and self-soothe? Has it been easier to work than it has been to be home? Because we may have kids at home, or home may be lonely for a lot of us. Where have our values and our behaviors not matched? And that's a lot of what we talk about with our clients, right? Many of you have probably a lot of experience when it comes to addiction. And when we look at gauging whether or not there's a problem, I want to really stop and look at the fact that when we look at not only physiological symptoms of addiction, but also behavioral symptoms of addiction, whether we're focusing on the use of alcohol, other chemicals, or process addictions, these symptoms are all accurate. So really identifying in our practices, even especially when you're not necessarily able to see all of your clients face to face, and you're using virtual resources to be able to connect with them, how do we lean into the ways that we're able to assess chemical use? Because the reality is, only one thing has changed, which is everything. Change is something that is the most stressful thing for all of us as human beings. And there's going to be ways that both ourselves and our clients are going to maladaptively cope. So there's going to be times when having a diagnosis or putting a label on it may not necessarily be the right move in that moment. And how do we preemptively really look at the ways that people are coping in ways that just aren't working for them? I also want to talk for a minute about what makes it disordered. What does that look like? And I think old language, as we look at the DSM-4, we looked at the whole concept of use of a chemical, abusing a chemical or an addictive behavior, and then dependence on it, physical dependence on it. And as we look at the DSM-5 and we move to mild, moderate, and severe symptoms, really looking at the fact that we can have mild symptoms that don't necessarily lead to a full-blown moderate or severe use disorder. And the example that I would give is as we look at ways that people drink in a college setting. There's times when people use alcohol and there's times when they abuse it and they don't end up in a position where they are addicted to it. They continue their college experience, their drinking slows down and or stops and they continue on with life. As we look at, the people who hold on to behaviors that are no longer working for them, are acquiring consequences, are acting outside of their value system. And by the way, it's really impacting their mental health. We're in a position where we can start looking at where is another issue starting to come to the surface and how do I assess that? As we look at addiction, one of the things that we really have to focus on is the fact that there are a lot of influencers out there at this time when we look at social isolation. For many of us, when we think about the stay-at-home order, there's very few people that we're connecting to. And there's very few people that clients are really connecting to. Social media ends up having a very loud voice in the midst of this pandemic. And here's how social media is normalizing problematic drinking and substance use. Me at 30 days into quarantine, a 6-pack of beer. Look at me. I'm your breakfast now. Make yourself a quarantini. The amount of memes that are out there around homeschooling children and parenting children are pretty incredible. This is today's homeschool lesson on fractions. I saw something the other day that we're all in trouble because 20 years from now, our country is going to be run by kids who are homeschooled by drunk parents. I might not have toilet paper, but I sure do feel ready when I look at this caption and this picture. So as we look at some of these pieces, there's different ways that social media reflects our maladaptive ways of coping with discomfort and fear. That's where we are. For many of us, we're in a spot of discomfort and fear. So how has social media really leaned into and allowed us to participate in our defense system, right? We think about avoidance and humor. I mean, look at this. Coronavirus won't stop Betty from going to bingo. Numbing, blaming, pointing the finger, judgment. I love this quote from Carl Jaspers, and I'm just going to take a moment to read it. It very much rings true when I try really hard not to be on social media for a long period of time throughout the day, because when we look at the amount of time that we can, for me, I can lose time in the midst of social media and can really, my thought processes can significantly change based on what I'm reading. And I love this quote by Carl Jaspers. Neither hopelessness or confidence can be proven by rational knowledge. The arguments for despair, deducting inevitabilities from total knowledge, are inadequate, as are the arguments trusting in the victory of common sense. Despair and confidence are moods, not insights. They are called pessimism and optimism. Neither one is open to persuasion. Each finds infinite arguments and overlooks the counter arguments. We look at the ways that we try to arm ourselves with information and use it as a weapon or a blanket, rather than a tool to make informed decisions. Somebody had said to me recently, I just want to read enough that I almost want to read my way out of my own anxiety. We have to ask ourselves and our clients, how is it that we're being more intentional about consuming COVID news? Social media, if you think about the ways that it reflects our maladaptive ways of coping, extreme optimism, right, based on a lack of information, or we talked about judgment, intellectualizing. I just need more information to feel better. Those defense mechanisms that shield emotions that we don't want to experience, that's what addiction and mental health concerns are all about, if you think about it. I use this frequently with clients, and I wanted to share it with you. You could take it, leave it, do whatever you want with it. When we think about the core feelings that we may have the most difficulty in acknowledging and really sitting with, we talk about guilt and shame and fear and pain and hurt and inadequacy. And when we look at ourselves, our clients, social media, our friends and our family, how is it that we're defending ourselves against the emotions that we're not quite ready to handle? What do we tell ourselves about uncomfortable feelings? And what is your emotional competency? It's a good question when we look at, really posing questions to our clients. What is your emotional competency? What does that look like for you? Brene Brown has put out some podcasts recently that many of you may have seen. If you have not, it's definitely worth looking into. And what she talks about in one of her podcasts is the whole idea of emotional competency that you could use as a resource with your clients, and looking at what are the emotions that we naturally lean in and out of. What does that look like for us? And as it relates to some of our fear. Because the reality is, when we look at that process of numbing and avoidance and how we move to connection, what does that look like for us? So we typically in group settings we'll check in with a MEPS check, mentally, emotionally, physically, and spiritually. Where am I? And where am I in a scale of 1 to 10, connected to myself, to something bigger, and to my peers? And connection today looks very different than it did 2 months ago, for our clients and for us. As we start to look at the parallel process and how our struggles really reflect those of our clients, that phrase comes to mind that I can't take my clients to a place that I'm not willing or able to go to myself. And that doesn't mean being in recovery or not. That doesn't mean recovering from sexual abuse if I am treating those recovering from sexual abuse, or having a firsthand knowledge of depression when I'm treating those who are struggling with depression. It doesn't mean that. What it really means is I can't take clients to a place that I'm not willing to go. If I'm expecting them to participate in vulnerability, I need to do the same. If I'm asking them to really hold a mirror up to themselves and look inward and acknowledge that it begins and ends with them, I need to be willing to do the same thing myself. And the reality is, for so many of us, we are so impacted by this in so many different ways. I want to talk about brain chemistry just for a moment. I'm a big fan that things happen for reasons. And when we look at the chemicals that are impacted by addiction and by mental health concerns, I really like this slide to look at the different chemicals and what it is that they're responsible for. So as we look at dopamine, the reward and pleasure molecule, for those of us that understand a lot about addiction, we acknowledge the primary role that dopamine has in an addictive system. Serotonin is also a huge piece when we think about confidence and self-esteem and everything that goes into that. We also look at oxytocin and vasopressin. Hallmark makes billions of dollars every year off of those two chemicals, oxytocin and vasopressin. And those two are really responsible for bonding and connection, that feeling of falling in love. My husband's great, and part of the reason I'm with him is because I have oxytocin and vasopressin that get released around him. So we think about those elements, and the fact that when we identify social distancing and the fact that our social network and peer group and those who we love and connect to, there's very little people that we're able to physically connect to right now. Norepinephrine, the danger molecule, and epinephrine, the energy molecule. I want you guys to identify the fact that with all of these chemicals, there's a fine balance in all of them that really keep us emotionally balanced and healthy. Now, when we look at less social interaction and less connection, when we think about purpose and meaning at times being really challenged, when we think about the increase of anxiety and the increase of depression and the increase of substance use, for many people, we are now chemically imbalanced. Maybe not necessarily always in a way where we can have a standalone anxiety disorder or a standalone depressive disorder. There are people that are there right now. That may not be for everyone. And for many of us, we're chemically changed as a result of the changes that are happening with COVID. Again, only one thing has changed, which is everything. In the end, we have so many similarities to our clients. How are we and our clients chemically challenged at a time like this? And when we think about moving into the solution, how can we behaviorally counteract some of those challenges? Will we seek to re-regulate to feel better, but also to combat the fatigue that we're all experiencing? So as we move forward and we really start to think about some of the pieces around solutions, Doug Tiemann is our CEO at Caron, and I very much appreciate the fact that he identifies this being a marathon and not a sprint. Because I think that's a piece that when we look at the fatigue that we've had over the past 6, 7, 8 weeks, I did a group supervision with some of our clinicians a few days ago, and as we checked in, one of the themes that had come up was feeling like it's, quote, Groundhog Day. And for those of you who may be at home who are Zooming with your clients and doing virtual counseling, our day-to-day routines have changed so drastically. We have to really ask ourselves, how does the body tell a story that the mind can easily forget? I think for many of us, we're so resilient and we're in a position where it can be so easy to get up and do the next right thing, enter the next session, and continue with sessions through the end of the day. In inpatient treatment, it may be trying to manage the next crisis, to do the next best thing based on the information we have, shooting at a moving target. And how do I allow myself to slow down enough to acknowledge what it is that my body's telling me? We do a lot of mindfulness-based stress reduction work up here with our clients that just has such good research and efficacy that many of us know as it relates to, craving management and anxiety reduction and stress reduction and improved sleep and everything that happens with addiction. MBSR a lot of times can really take a look at. And I tell my clients frequently that your body tells a story that your mind will easily forget. My mind will have me push through the anxiety and the fear and the stress. For many of us, if we're in a helping profession, we want to try to put others' needs before us. It's not healthy, and it's something that we may have a natural tendency to want to do. But then we realize that we need to step back into self-care. My body tells a story that my mind will easily forget. My body tells me that I'm stressed in where I hold it in my shoulders. My body will tell me that I'm stressed in the stress headache that I get, the struggles I may have in sleeping. What story is your mind telling you? What does that look like? And as we continue forward in the marathon that we're currently in, and our states start opening up, thinking about those rules and those guidelines that are put out there for suggestion, we need to be really mindful of what we're doing with all of that. And the reality is that the more we may struggle with addiction and mental health overall, and depressive symptoms and anxiety-related symptoms and loneliness, utter loneliness, it may be more difficult for our clients and for us to follow those guidelines because we crave connection. As mammals, as human beings, we are inherently spiritual in nature, and we crave connection. I think we've been doing it the best that we can currently in the situation that we're in. And there's a part of us that really wants more. So we ask ourselves, how are we aware of where we are right now? Many of us will teach our clients about the state of receptive awareness that enables us to pay attention to what's happening right now without judging. And that's mindfulness, that's mindful awareness, right? How can I be aware of what's happening right now without judging it? For many people, I've heard stories from our clients and actually our staff here at Caron at times that they may get stuck on a piece of information from social media and really struggle with being in the moment. There's also many people that are looking ahead at what I will do when. It's not a bad coping skill to be able to plan for the future and get excited about something. And how do we visit the future but not live there? It's okay to visit and make plans, but then how do we come back into our right now and take care of where our mind and our feet really meet each other? What does that look like for us? I really appreciate this, this image that talks about some of the basic tenets of mindfulness. And when I look at this, I don't want to educate you on this because many people know the basic tenets of mindfulness. But what I want you to really think about for a moment is if you had to scale your health in these areas on a scale of 1 to 5, I just want to take a moment and ask you to go through and write down on a scale of 1 to 5, where do you find yourself? For non-judgment of yourself and of others. 1 being, you are not doing very well with it. You are your own worst critic these days. And other people get in the midst of the fire too. 5, you feel pretty strong in your ability to not judge. Same thing with patience. How about acceptance for what is? Scale of 1 to 5. What about non-striving? What about trust? In a 12-step program, if you read the big book, it doesn't overtly say this, but it basically talks about this spiritual process of hope turning to faith, turning to trust. Hope is that I have a belief that something could get better. I don't know what, I don't know how, but I hope it will. Faith is I can't quite see it. I'm not fully sure, but there's a part of me that believes that it probably will get better. I just need to have faith. Trust is, I know that no matter what, it's going to be okay. I know that no matter what it is, I may not be able to see the outcome. I may not be able to see it, the future. I can't control if something happens to my children. If a loved one gets diagnosed with COVID, if I lose my job, if I lose my income, I can't control those things, but I trust that I'm going to be okay. I don't know what that's going to look like. Scale of 1 to 5, where are we with that? Scale of 1 to 5, where are we with letting go? Letting go of that which we can't control, letting go of the outcome. Scale of 1 to 5, where are you with a beginner's mind? Where you enter situations with a sense of curiosity and uncertainty and wonderment. What does that look like for you? We have to first ask ourselves where we are in the midst of all of that before we start really questioning where our clients are. I was on a webinar not too long ago. I have a huge amount of respect for Onsite down in Tennessee, and I was on this webinar with 2 of their clinicians, and I really appreciated their talk about the dance between faith and reality is really where a lot of us are, right? We have to sit in reality for what it is, and we can't get lost in wishful thinking and burying our heads in the sand. We have to be a part of reality. And there's this whole other element of faith that creates this dynamic of balance. Faith, that which I can't see or I don't know, and reality is seeing it for what it is. When we talk about the phrase from A Tale of Two Cities, recovery is really a spiritual path of hope, turning to faith, turning to trust, right? that epic of belief that we had talked about in the beginning? And how is it that we're helping our clients on their own spiritual journey? So I want to talk just for a minute about practical application before we get into some Q&A. Thinking about practical application, you can go on a ton of different Zoom meetings and get a ton of different resources and support. I have the rest of the presentation about resource and support. So when we talk about living in the solution, if I understand my own serenity prayer, understanding the difference between what I can and can't control and where am I spending my energy, how do I as a clinician really lean into that, and how do I encourage my clients to also lean into that? Also realizing and remembering that social distancing isn't social isolation, it's physical distancing. So how do we combat isolation when, for many of us, we're treating people who have mental health issues that naturally isolate us? How do we limit the amount of time spent on the news? I oversee 5 different men's programs up here at Caron, and we have our clients watching the news, and there's a limited amount of it, because I think that the amount of information that's out there on social media and mainstream media in general can drive anyone nuts. How do we reduce the amount of social media that we're participating in, but also the amount of news that we're watching? That dance between faith and reality. What does our routine look like? We probably talk to our clients about that all the time. Radical self-acceptance we talked about. Self-protective measures. How do we connect with ourselves, our others, and our own spirituality? So when I think about spirituality, you can find 20 different books with 20 different definitions of spirituality. The one that makes the most sense to me is that I'm a small part of a larger whole. I'm a small part of a bigger picture. So I come from a really big Italian family that can be crazy at times. I'm a small part of that. I'm a small part of my support network of, strong people in recovery around me. I'm a small part of everything that's happening around here. I'm a small part of the community of 372 people that are a part of what we're doing today and the ways that we change lives and get to be a part of the solution. I'm a small part of all that. The question is, how do I tap into that? When you participate in this webinar and you're engaged and you're focused and you're present, it's you participating in spirituality because you're connecting to something bigger. How is it that we're helping our clients tap into that? What does that look like for them? We can't bring clients to a place that we're struggling to go ourselves, right? How do we reach out? All the time, not just when I need it, but all the time, because it's so much easier to do it when I need it, when I've been doing it all the time anyway. How do I give back? So one of the things that we talk about a lot is the whole concept of a purpose-driven life. And when we look at that third stage of grief that many of us are going through, we talk about bargaining and denial and anger. And as we move towards acceptance, we then can move towards purpose. As clinicians, I think leaning into our own purpose at a time like this, we are needed all the time, and we're really needed now. How do we tap into our own purpose? And what does that look like for our clients? I want to end by giving you a ton of resources, and Adam and I think it will be able to email you some of these pieces after this will be available afterwards. But Caron wants to let you know that we're here for you, for your clients, as a thought partner with you, to align with you if someone needs a higher level of care, but also to really look at the resources that we're giving to our clients, not only in treatment, but post-treatment. I have different pieces of literature here, online meetings, different activities. When we think about the wellness of mind, body, and spirit, exercise programs, and then a ton of links and articles that you can access right here around grief, staying sane. I love these 6 daily questions to ask yourself in quarantine. This is a great resource that I've actually used with some of the clinicians that I oversee, and other resources as we go along. So I want to end there for the sake of time. We have about 6 minutes left. And Adam, I'm going to kick it back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kate. We'll now move on to a Q&A portion of our presentation. So if you haven't done so already, please type your questions using the Q&A feature. We've had quite a few questions already, so we're going to get to as many as possible in the next 5 minutes. So to start off, the first question I have is, you talk about the parallel process. Is this a time to self-disclose our own fears and how we are personally coping with our patients?
That is a great question. And it's funny because that's a question that came up in a supervision up here literally a few days ago. I think that when we go back to our training in self-disclosure, we identify that the only reason that self-disclosure is appropriate is if it's for the benefit of the client, right? So we know this as clinicians. If it's for the benefit of the client, absolutely. I think you have to be careful. I think two things need to be true. One, we're human, and sometimes it's okay for our clients to know that we're human, that we make mistakes, that there's things that we're afraid of, that we have coping skills that work, right? That we may have coping skills that don't work. I think you have to ask yourself how specific you're choosing to be. And I also think that you need to ask yourself, if you're a professional that they're leaning into for support, it's okay to disclose the fact that when we looked at collective grief and collective fear, that you may be experiencing that too. And you have to be careful not to use your patient as a sounding board for your own needs. So I would say the answer to that is yes, if it's within their, their needs, not yours.
Thank you. A similar question to piggyback off of that. Often when we grieve, we have someone to turn to who can comfort us. However, it's hard to find someone who is not also grieving right now and looking for their own comfort. What do you recommend to help us navigate this?
That's such a great point. Two things. One of the things that I've realized is that there's certain resources that I have that the people around me don't, and there's certain things that the people around me have that I don't. So I may be in a position that I emotionally am feeling really centered, but struggling financially. How do I allow myself to be a sounding board to someone else who may be struggling emotionally and lean into them to maybe support me financially? I think when we think about the importance of pooling our resources as a community, that's something that is so important right now. So yes, we're all grieving. And I also think that when we look at the ways that we're grieving, the ways that we're struggling and the fears that we have, it's okay to lean into those that may not necessarily be struggling with it. Here's another fact though, when you look at the importance of, or the efficacy of group counseling and 12-step and support groups, many times people will lean into other people who are struggling in the same way as a way to connect. That's part of the reason why 12-step groups and support groups and group therapy works so effectively. So I think two things need to be true at the same time. I think it's okay to lean into people who are also struggling, but also looking at, if somebody has something that I need, think about sponsorship. You have something I want. I'm going to ask you to sponsor me. I'm also going to look at leaning into different supports based on what you have that I'm struggling with right now.
Thank you. One last question, and we have about a minute to answer it, but how do we encourage positivity in patients who are in long-term treatment and feel isolated?
How do we encourage positivity for clients in long-term treatment and feel isolated? So I would say starting with helping them understand what that isolation feels like for them, and also look at solution-focused counseling, right? So I'll use a parallel process. As I look at group supervision and people that feel like they're stuck in Groundhog Day, for a lot of people, that stuckness and isolation, we're experiencing that as clinicians, and our clients are experiencing that. So how do I lean into that which can happen and be effective? So when we think about that feeling of stuckness, how are we spiritually stuck? Because many times we're not going to physically feel stuck if we're spiritually doing well. So there's a part of me that would almost want to lean into the spiritual aspect of it, and the ways that we can connect in meaningful ways that are not necessarily within 6 feet for longer than 10 minutes. I would say leaning into some of those other elements, and also starting to plan things for the future. Again, visiting the future, but not necessarily living there, coming back into today.
Great. Well, thank you, Kate. That's all we have time for today. As a reminder, we are offering continuing education credit for social workers for this webinar. A survey will be posted for you to take immediately following this presentation in order to obtain credits. You will receive a certificate of completion in the next couple of weeks. Also, please join Caron next Tuesday for the next installment of our webinar series, during which we will address the topic, Getting High in Harrowing Times, the Risks and Repercussions of Marijuana Use. Our speaker next week is Dr. Susan Blank, Medical Director of Caron Atlanta. Watch your email for more details. Also, please remember to reach out to your local regional resource director for any additional information or questions. Thank you all again for joining us, and have a great afternoon. Goodbye.